Welcome to Mindful Management, Creating a Trauma-Informed Work Environment, a podcast by Chefalo Consulting, where we share the knowledge, stories, and resources you need to create a trauma-informed culture that supports wellness, growth, and resilience. I'm your host, Shenandoah Chefalo. Welcome, everyone. So excited to have you join us for another episode of our podcast, Mindful Management. Today, we're delighted to welcome a longtime friend of mine. I've been hoping to get her on our podcast for a while now, Barbara Petee, who's an influential advocate for social justice and health equity. She currently just stepped down as the executive director of the Root Cause Coalition, and she remains an advisor to them. With over 3 decades of experience in healthcare communications and government relations, Barb has been pivotal in fostering cross-sector collaborations aimed at addressing the root causes of health inequities. Her leadership has expanded the coalition from its founding partners to an impressive network of over 90 organizations, all committed to transforming healthcare delivery through community-driven solutions. Beyond the boardroom, Barb's an avid reader, enjoys hiking, both of which she credits with keeping her grounded and connected to the community and nature. Today, she joins us to deep dive into how organizations can embrace social determinants of health to create healthier, more equitable communities. And even more so than being a friend, Barb is also a Michigan State Spartan. We love that about you. Welcome, Barb. We're so happy to have you with us.
Thank you, Shen, and go green. Delighted to be with you.
Go white. We talk about this sometimes. We're also hopeful about taking some of these things we talk about to applying to our beloved university.
Yes, we do. We'll get there. We have patience in all things.
We do. Hey, before we kind of dive into, because I want you to share with our listeners about root cause, because I think some of them will know about root cause, some of them will not. But before we dive into that, tell us kind of a bit about what sparked your passion for health equity and social justice and how that stored you towards the work that you do today.
Well, that's a really easy answer, and I'm happy you asked it right out of the gate here because it was my parents who were my influence. I am the youngest of 7. As you know, I was born and mostly raised in Michigan until my father was transferred to Ohio when I was in high school. But I beat feet right back up to Michigan, did a couple-year stint at University of Detroit, and then transferred to Michigan State, and I'm a proud alum, and it served me well, and have served on the alumni board. But back to my parents, both of them were very, very committed to social justice. Again, the youngest of 7, all 7 of us learn from their example on what happens to others happens to us. And people who have listened to my own podcast know I don't like, quips and quotes, but a high tide really does lift all boats. And it's incumbent on every one of us to do our best to make sure those behind us have a level field to live their own life of, full potential and opportunities. And there is so much inequity as we look around us that there is really no lack of opportunity to get involved in whatever that issue is that is the fire in your belly or spark in your heart. So I learned from them. I learned by their example, and I would go even further back a generation to my grandfather, Theodore Weber. He was born in Chelsea, Michigan, on a farm, one of many, many children, the first in the family to come off the farm and graduate from high school, worked for Detroit Edison, and he and my grandmother raised my mom and her 2 brothers in Ypsilanti, and he was just a pillar of the community. He's an angel. He walked among us and just lived by example of doing well by others. And if someone came to their back door who was hungry, he fed them. If they needed a bed, there was the sleeping porch. He unlocked the church every single day. He did whatever the community needed. And he stayed in that community his entire life, which was almost 102 years. But I really am so blessed that I have all the examples of grandparents, parents, and then my own siblings. We're all in our 60s and 70s now, which seems crazy. I think we've all got ourselves locked in our 30s and 40s somewhere, but the reality is we're not. And we are the oldest generation in the family. My parents are both gone. But I think we all try and live by their example and how they taught us to live true to ourselves and for others as well. So that's the foundation, and I carry it with me every single day.
I love that because I think a lot of times, even when I'm in systems and working in systems, one of the things I see very often is people at the end of their career who want to make the changes that we're talking about, right? Like they've been in it so long and they've been fighting the fight the whole time, don't get me wrong, but as you kind of approach the end of your career, I think there's a lot of focus on legacy, right? It's not now about changing the workplace to make your own work environment better. It's about the people who come beyond you. So I just love that, even for you talking about the legacy of your family and how that kind of carries through as well, about what can we do for those left behind us. So tell us, Barb, about Root Cause, kind of the mission there, and what sparked the idea for tackling specifically health equity.
Absolutely. And I want to go back to that last comment you made about oftentimes it is at the end of an individual's career. I was really blessed, and as I think about the first answer I just gave you, I was really blessed, but I think it was so innate in my DNA that if I wasn't working on something that I thought would help the greater good, I really didn't feel like I was making that big of a difference. I may have been doing well in my job with the responsibilities that I had, but if it wasn't as broad as I thought it could be, then that always sort of got into my head. And so I was, as you mentioned in the introduction, in healthcare for almost 4 decades. I retired earlier this year after a 38-year career with a health system in Toledo, Ohio, based in Toledo, Ohio. It serves Northwest Ohio and Southeast Michigan. Had just an extraordinary career there and started out in communications and over time wound up and ended up as the chief government relations and advocacy officer. And I love politics. I love history. Again, I think that's because of my parents. I remember so many moments in history where my mother would call me and she's like, "You need to watch this." I mean, I was 10 years old. She's like, "You'll remember this someday." And I do. I remember every one of those moments. But again, it was always realizing you had to be part of something bigger than yourself or bigger than your family or bigger than your immediate circle. And so I understood health policy because I'd been in a healthcare arena for so long. But individuals who are our elected officials don't usually run on a specific healthcare policy like 340B or site neutral or, there's A to Z things that I could put out there. They run on those kitchen table issues that we all hear about. It's the cost of healthcare. It's the cost of housing. It's, inflation, and I can't put food on the table. And so when we in Northwest Ohio started realizing the struggles that our own community was having, and this goes back to the economic downturn of, '08, what are we going to do? What don't we as a not-for-profit health system have as much responsibility to care for the people outside of our four walls as those who come to us when conditions get worse? And couldn't we, if we take that theory, if we start doing things better in community called prevention, aka public health, wouldn't we have a better outcome of not having so many people with chronic conditions if we could, stop it at the beginning? So then we just started pulling that string, and it led us further and further into the issue of nutrition and hunger and the realization of how much hunger was an issue in our community and how a lot of people have always lived in that space, but certainly at the economic downturn, people were battling with how am I going to continue to pay the mortgage, the car payment, put food on the table. They were embarrassed to ask for assistance. And so we tried to demystify or destigmatize, I should say, all those issues. And we started talking about hunger as a health issue. So I started talking with the elected officials who I met with very regularly in my role about hunger as a health issue. And you've probably heard me cite this example more than once, Shem, because you've been in the room with me so often, which is wonderful. Because we're in Southeast Michigan, or ProMedica is in Southeast Michigan. Of course, Senator Stabenow, who sits on the Senate Ag Committee, was one of the offices with whom I'd meet. And so I was in D.C., which I often was, and we scheduled a meeting for Senator Stabenow's staff. And they knew me. We had a wonderful working relationship, but it was usually on health policy. And got in the office, and it was the Health LA, and she said, "Well, I'm sure you're here to talk about SGR." And I said, "Actually, no, I want to talk about the Farm Bill." And everything changed It was, what do you mean you wanna talk about the farm? But what's going on?" It's like, "Well, we wanna talk about nutrition and lack of nutrition and what would happen to individual health if the farm bill isn't reauthorized." And suddenly, Senator Stabenow was available to join the meeting, and things changed, and really, it was hunger as a health issue that ProMedica took on as an issue that led our organization to say, "Hey, let's do this summit up on Capitol Hill." We had just joined as the first healthcare member, as a member of the Alliance to End Hunger, based in DC. And when we joined, our former CEO and I were meeting with them, and we said, we want to be active members. We don't want to be members in name only. So, what would be helpful? So we hatched this plan to do this national summit up on the Hill, and we would talk about hunger as a health issue and what healthcare's role would be in prevention as public health. And what is the community's role? What is the faith-based sector's role? And what role do elected officials have in this? Because it isn't any one sector's responsibility 100%. So we did this, and we had an incredible turnout. Those who have been on Capitol Hill to meet with elected officials know more often than not that it is the staff, not the actual elected official. We had a standing room only. Many, many elected were there for as long as they could be. They would text their staff and say, "Come and take my place. I got to go, be on the floor of the House or the Senate." And it lasted for 4 hours, which, again, you get 15 minutes with a staffer, you're good. And this just went on, and we had great presentations that were really connecting all the dots to hunger as a health issue from infancy through end of life in the senior population. In the audience that day, as a participant, a guest, were representatives from the AARP Foundation. And they came up to me at the end and said also to our CEO, "Hey, this was amazing. Whatever you are thinking about doing next, let's talk. Maybe we can do something together." So likewise, at the end of that summit, we had been working with the USDA. We had Undersecretary Concannon as a speaker, was working with folks from the USDA to really help put the agenda together. And USDA said to us, "This was so amazing. Would you be willing to go around the country to our different USDA regions, since most people can't hop on planes and come to the Hill, and kind of recreate this in each of the regions?" And we were really happy to do that. And that gave us an agenda, or venues, if you will, for about 18 months, during which time we continued to talk with AARP Foundation. We called those sessions Come to the Table. They were half-day events, and we brought local community groups, health systems together to talk exactly about what we had in Washington. And what started out as ProMedica and AARP Foundation co-hosting these as we started traversing around the country, by the end of all of the different regions, it was the Root Cause Coalition. And then we very quickly learned that, okay, hunger is a health issue, but so is housing, and so is education, and so is transportation, and so is isolation. And we did a kickoff to announce the establishment of Root Cause in October of 2015. I have to digress for a second. It was 2 days after the miracle in the big house, so I was still flying high. I was like, "Oh, I'm so happy that I get to go to DC after Michigan State being Michigan in the big house." Okay, I digress. Thank you for allowing me to do that.
It's these life moments that remind us where we were when something happened.
It was these life moments. I'll never forget it, because I just sat there watching that clip 1,000 times, and I had been at the game, but that's a whole different podcast, I guess, for a different day. But it was a good week in my mind, and I thought, okay, we're gonna announce this. This is gonna be great. We had about 12 members who had joined us. We really wanted to be able to point to members as we were announcing the establishment of the coalition, and it grew from there. And it was supposed to be a side gig to my chief government relations and advocacy role. And actually for 7 years it was, and it became amazing. As I look back, it's like, how did I do both jobs? I'm not really sure, but I did. And I'm glad I did, because both really played off the other quite well. But as we continued to grow, it became very obvious that, to me, this is where my heart was. And I relinquished the local and state government relation responsibilities and then just stayed with federal and was able to focus on root cause. That's what I've been doing for the last few years. And then, as you mentioned, I just recently, as July 1st of this year, stepped down as executive director, president of the coalition. And in an advisory capacity, it has my heart, and I know it has a great future. And I know that our nation feels very committed to health equity, social justice issues. And so I think we're off to and have been in a great place and can only continue to thrive from here.
Barbara, I appreciate so much you sharing the story of root cause, and I've been fortunate enough to hear it and be in the room with you several times talking about it. What I think is great for our listeners is one is the thing that always resonates for me when you tell the story are maybe two things that come to mind right now. One is you can't do this work alone. It takes an enormous amount of partnerships, but I think that's an important piece for our listeners is that many of them are trying to tackle really big issues in the social justice, in the health equity frame, in the trauma informed frame. And it can feel overwhelming very often at times. And one of the things I always say is like, you got to learn to ask. You can't do this alone. And many of us are in this mindset of like, I'm going to do it myself. And it's a great notion to have, but we can't. Like it's going to take a lot of us to push this rock up this hill, right?
Absolutely. It's going to take a lot of us, and it's going to take a lot of time. I mean, we are in a space that has decades, frankly, if not centuries of history behind it, right? You can't undo the wrongs overnight. You can continually talk about them and work to a better spot. And that's what I would always say is I do believe the needle has been moved in these now almost 9 years since the coalition was founded. But you have to be ready to accept incremental change and build on that success. And more than anything, you have to keep yourself strong so that those who come behind you can see, well, he or she never gave up. So I guess, the road's that much more paved for those who come behind us. And that's as much as what I've always tried to do as to say, what win can I notch? I don't know, I don't know. Maybe just establishing it was enough, the win.
And that's the legacy piece again, right? Is like, I'm trying to make this piece of the road a little easier to traverse for the next person.
Correct.
The other thing that always sticks out for me, and I want to dive into this a little bit because one of the things I want to have you do is kind of, given your background, how do we explain something like social determinants of health in a really like easy digestible way? But the reason I want to ask you that question is the use of language. Is that whether we're talking about adverse childhood experiences, whether we're talking about social emotional learning in the education setting, whether we're talking about trauma-informed systems and principles, or in this case, social determinants of health. I think it's why I love when you said, I want to talk about the Farm Bill and everything changed, is that sometimes language does matter, and finding the right language for the group of people or partners that you're trying to bring on board to your cause matters. And so can you just talk about that and maybe how sometimes social determinants of health hinders you and sometimes how it helps you, but how can even those not in the healthcare field understand what we mean when we say social determinants of health?
It's a great question, and it's worth a lot of discussion and probably even more than we have time for today. But I was on a call earlier this week with a health system, and they're working with a researcher, and part of that discussion was, do you like social drivers? Do you like social determinants? And we've started to make the conscious decision, really since the end of last year, 2023, to use the word drivers. And I think it's a nuance, but I think it's a better selection of the word in there because the drivers really do drive the outcomes. The determinants are already, that implies that it's preordained, predetermined. We have a chance to switch what the drivers are or change how the drivers are being addressed. That said, so I would probably lean towards social drivers of health versus social determinants. That said, I would kick them both off the shelf and go back to what I said, that we're talking about public health. I think we get so tied down into the titles of things. And this was actually a discussion at last year's National Summit. And Katie Crosby, who is our incoming chair, currently vice chair of the Board of Trustees, this was a question that was posed to a panel that she was leading. And she said, we change the words every few years. We're not solving the issues. Let's not worry about what we call them. Let's go to what these are. These are basic needs that if we look at, the principles on which this country was founded, we do believe that people were created equal. We should then believe that people have access to the same opportunities and things that will allow them a life of dignity and health and well-being. No one is saying someone can't excel at A or B or C or that you have to choose this path, but let's at least agree that we don't want kids hungry. We don't want children living in poverty. We don't want seniors after a life of doing oh so much for so many to make absolutely horrendous choices between whether or not they're going to feed their pet or themselves or eat at all, because if they choose to eat, they won't be able to pay the mortgage or the rent. Their dignity and holding on to yourself as someone who has seen her parents age, it's so crucial. It's just something we have to really take into consideration. And that's why, again, I look back on my upbringing, and it's like, take a step back. This isn't just about the individual. It's about all of us. And you doing well is not going to affect me to do poorly. It's going to lift us all. And so I'm less concerned about how we label it as to what we do. And I think if we just talk about some basic needs and Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you need food, you need clothing, and you need shelter, and you need love. And love means you understand that people care about you. I'm not talking about, oh, you fell in love with me. I'm talking about you understand that people care. And if people felt that, oh my goodness, that's not Pollyanna. That's true for how we all have to, bring that piece forward for others.
And I think it's such a critical thing. And let's just talk about food and food insecurity. It's such a big part of my own story and my own life. And it's definitely a cause that's near and dear to my heart because I don't think people understand how prevalent food insecurity is, especially in a nation, right? When we're talking about the United States, a nation, to me, it's as a taxpayer, it's one of the hardest concepts for me to wrap my mind around, that in a nation of so many people and children especially go hungry every day. And people are often surprised because, I went to a lot of different schools in this nation from the West Coast to the Midwest and spent a lot of time in a lot of different places. And because of that, the public school system is really different depending on your location in this nation. And in some schools it was, there was lunch. In some schools that I attended, there was a breakfast and lunch program. And when I tell people that oftentimes that was the only meal I was eating or two meals I was eating a day. And when summer break rolled around, it was a hard 3 months. Those could be really hard days. I think, what is the way that we can help people understand how prevalent food insecurity is in this nation for those who maybe think it's just parents who are making bad choices, who don't know how to budget money, who are choosing to be on assistance of some kind because I think there's some myths that prevail about the population around food insecurity in this nation.
I think we all come to various issues with some kind of bias, right? We can admit that about ourselves. We're human beings and we're fallible. I think what we are called to do, we'll take food insecurity as the issue as you're discussing it. You're right. There's a lot of, oh, well, if they would just do this, or, oh, I got up and I made breakfast for my kids. I mean, put that on the shelf if you can. That's, I would say, I beg you to put that on the shelf and just consider the challenges. And it's hard to get out of a cycle of poverty. I think once you're in it, it's a pretty steep climb with some pretty slippery walls to get out of it. And unfortunately, so many systems are set up that once you do start to climb up those very slippery walls, you're not penalized, but suddenly the benefits on which you relied are starting to dissolve. And so, if I'm a single mom and I have an opportunity to better my employment, but bettering my employment takes away the benefits that keep food on the table, well, I want to feed my kids. And it's not a slow and appropriate paced climb out. It's okay, well, now your rent goes up. Now those benefits go away. Good luck. You're making $11 an hour. Make it work. And I just don't think you can make it work. I think if we're all being realistic, we know how hard it is to make ends meet, regardless of what our income is. Can you imagine living on $11 an hour as your primary income? I mean, no is the answer. So it is an issue. It's not getting better. We saw what the child tax credit did during COVID. It really helped families across the board. And so I would look at those types of policies and those types of solutions as, again, not taking from someone else, but helping the greater good. And so when you're without a lot of those most basic needs, you despair. That starts to affect your mental health. That starts to affect the way you look at everything around you. And when you're sad, when you're feeling defeated, that affects how you have an ability to go look for a job or perform in school or whatever. I'm not giving anyone a pass, but I'm also not giving any of us a pass. We have got to realize that this is all of us. This is us, folks, and we get one shot at this. We have one life, and helping someone out seems like a whole lot better solution than not. And that may be sounding really simplistic, but it's not. And I think that is the problem, is that we make things so complicated. We make them so, well, how would we do? Well, and you're right. We live in a land of plenty. I mean, I live in Ohio, and I don't care how close you live to one of the many, many major cities in Ohio or its suburbs. You drive 5 miles and you're looking at the corn or the soybeans or the whatever was planted. And we have resources. We have to figure out how to distribute the resources and, do a better job and feeding individuals across this nation. And I'm really proud that Root Cause still has as its cornerstone hunger as a health issue, because if you're not eating, there is very little else that you're going to be focused on.
Yeah, for me, it remains a root cause in all the work I do. And I mean, our listeners know I spend a lot of time doing, workplace culture change. And I think some of them might be thinking, Chen, what does one thing have to do with the other? And I just go back to the basics. Even when we look at the beginning of adverse childhood experiences, it started in an obesity clinic. The research about long-term health impacts and what happens to us as children and the long-term impacts of this are huge. And Barb knows that I've been advocating for, it feels like a century, but it's definitely a decade and a half of the research needed around what happens to kids who suffer from food insecurity long term. Like, what's the long term effects? Because I think we don't talk about that, and not just on our health, to your point, our physical health, but on our long term outlook, mental health, what that means for education and achieving education standards, job standards. Like, what happens to those who suffer from food insecurity as kids? And I think part of me is a little bit of a pessimist, I think, because I've been doing this work so long. And I think maybe we don't want to know the answers sometimes, because then we're really face to face with what we need to do. It's so obvious that anybody railing against it, to me, only has something to gain by railing against it. Because the idea that all children shouldn't be fed is ridiculous, right? Like, so anybody coming up with a reason why people don't deserve equity, to me, this is where then I just have to follow the dollars and say, what's in it for you?
And again, I think we live in a time where we have to choose our words and how we describe things carefully, because I do believe, I really believe what I'm about to say. I do believe that there aren't a lot of people in this country that think it's okay for a child to starve. I think that, again, this goes back to the language. Some people will describe things one way, and that's offensive to another group. And some people will describe it then another way, and that's not enough for the other group. And we're at a war with ourselves because of words, while the very humanitarian needs are laid bare before us in our country. And so while I said earlier, how we define it isn't as much of a worry to me as how we do it, I do agree that we need to get to that common ground and agree to disagree on maybe the words we use, but on the outcomes and the effects and then the actions that we take. Can you agree, ma'am? Can you agree, sir? We don't want this child to go to bed hungry. Well, sure. Who would want that? Okay, so let's start there as opposed to what we typically hear. And, we can't become echo chambers of one side versus the other. And I think that's too much of what is happening. And it's not easy, Shen. That's why 9 years in, I'm really happy to say we formed it. We've made some, inroads, not just us as the coalition, but us as voices, coalescing, working with other organizations, working with other individuals, working with elected officials to find that common language and common ground. And, you start looking at some of the pilots that are coming out of CMS and talking about what should be reimbursed as far as healthcare delivery. I mean, ultimately, that's what we were trying to achieve. I should have included this in my intro about root cause. The ultimate goal here is to build a better healthcare delivery model, one that doesn't wait for that critical moment where someone comes in either the ER door, the front door, sent to the hospital from the clinic because things are so bad. Let's stop some of this stuff from ever getting to the point it does. And of course, there will always be a hospital. Of course, there will always be illness. We can't eradicate that. We know that. But we can do far, far better by our children, our adults, our seniors, and make sure that communities are healthy and whole. It's so overused, but we've got to break down those silos. It is a round table. It is not just on healthcare's shoulders. It is not just on the federal government's shoulders. It is not just on the church's shoulders or the schools. Teachers are so burdened by so many things. And that's a crisis too, because then you have teacher burnout, you have healthcare workforce burnout. If we can just get back to where we're sharing the responsibilities and understand there's an ebb and flow and a role for everyone at different times, at different percentages, I just think we get to a better place. And, I hope your listeners aren't like, well, easy for her to say, and I get it. I get it. It's not easy. I mean, we were a two-parent working household and had two kids. And I often say, oh my gosh, Thursdays when we first had kids, every other week was payday night. It's like, oh my gosh, what bill do we pay and what bill don't we pay? Because we got to pay daycare first. And, you start prioritizing those things. And it's hard. It was hard with the incomes that we had and what we were trying to do. And it's just, it's not an easy road. And so I think if people understood there were people who were there to support them universally, as opposed to feeling like, oh, if I seek this assistance, if I even share some of my stresses and strains, I'm going to be looked at as a failure or a deadbeat or, put whatever label you want on there. I think we've got to find our humanity among all of this. Yeah, we need to address hunger. We need to address transportation. We need to address our collective humanity. And that, again, is a topic for another day, I suppose.
Yeah, it's about that connection. I mean, you and I've talked about this, that, a lot of people think because I aged out of foster care and getting accepted to Michigan State was like, aha, we've done this big, huge thing. And I talk about, listen, I went to that campus and was so overwhelmed and was so alone. I mean, it's a ginormous campus, as most state universities are, with a lot of people. And I never felt so alone in my entire life, but that I went hungry quite often on that campus in spaces where, the cafeterias were closed down because kids aren't utilizing it on the weekends. And, so we're going to close the cafeteria for the weekend and those things, and not knowing, because I think this is the other piece, not even knowing what I needed, let alone who to ask for help. And you're right. All the things that prevented me, like I didn't know that there was a food pantry on MSU's campus until I was long after I was an alumni and they called me asking me for a donation. And I was like, wait, what? Where was this when I was a student? But even if I would have known, I think those myths of how will people see me and judge me played a ginormous role. And so this idea of connection, I think we sometimes downplay, is that how do we say the word belonging, but do we really allow people to belong as who they truly are?
Well, we have a long way to go on that one, I will say. And you're right. As I noted at the beginning of this conversation, I transferred into Michigan State, and that was that was very foreign to me. I went from a very, very small school, university, to one of the largest in the nation. The food service program is second only to the U.S. Army, I believe. And I mean, it is, you're right, it's ginormous. And trying to find your way around as an individual, I didn't want to look like I didn't know what I was doing because I wanted to look like I fit in immediately, but I didn't really fit in. And, I didn't have some of the barriers and issues that a lot of other people had. But man, it's hard on any given day for people to continue to put a foot forward. And just getting to there doesn't mean, oh, it's all good now. It's all problems are solved. We can wipe our hands and move on to the next thing. It's constant nurturing. That's why I say it's constantly going back to our humanity. I think we're going to find a better place. I always believe in our better angels. I am married to a man who is the most optimistic human being I've ever met. And
I need to invite you guys up so I can just get some of his optimism.
you need to get some of his optimism. He's an amazing person. We met at work. We met at the hospital. And the joke was we had known each other for 4 years before we became engaged and then married. And when people found out we were engaged, they're like, he's marrying you. I was like, okay, well, I'm really not that bad. But they're like, he's just the nicest guy I've ever met. He's marrying you. I'm thinking, yeah, well, get to know me. I mean, it's funny. That is how Tim Petee is perceived, and rightly so, because then people would say, is he always that nice? Is he always that optimistic? It's like, he really is. And what a lot of people didn't know about Tim is that he was bullied incessantly as a child, and really badly bullied. And he has said to me as an adult, as my husband, as my life partner, he's like, when you can go to bed at night and know you're not going to wake up and get pummeled under that tree as you're walking home from school, you can sleep peacefully. And he just made it a resolve that when he got out of that period of his life of having been bullied, he was going to treat people like he had always wanted to be treated. I mean, yeah, I'm sure you can hear the emotion in my voice as I recount this. The nicest man was not without some of the most challenging things, who felt so alone. And I'm not talking for a couple days he was bullied. It was a long period of time, and it shaped who he wanted to become. And he said, of course there are challenging days. Oh my goodness. As a family, we have not been exempt from challenging moments. As a young adult with his own parents, he was not exempt from challenging moments. His mother suffered greatly from depression, and he helped her deal with that. You decide who you want to become. And when you've been tapped to your core and you think your reserves are gone, as he said, you got to find the reserve you didn't know you had. And I think it's a mind shift. And that sounds easier, I know, than it is. And when you are in an environment where so many people feel they're at the end, that's when all of these issues that we've been talking about and addressing all of these issues really becomes important, so that people know, hey, somebody believes in me. If it's not in their own household or in their own immediate community, they are able to see support and care somewhere in their lives.
Again, it's the magic of the connection, right? It's the magic of bringing different groups together. It's the magic of all of those pieces. And so I'm just wondering, Barb, there's a lot of hard work still to be done. Both of us acknowledge that. But can you point to some maybe positive places of hope, whether it's a program that you've seen that's really done something magnificent? It might be in Ohio or in the US or even globally. Or is there some group outside of even the Root Cause Coalition where you're just like, holy cow, there's hope. There's the thing look at that. Look at what they've accomplished that you can point to or think of.
I think instead of pointing to one, because there are so many, and that's not a cop-out, I think I go back to having been in healthcare for as long as I was, even before the coalition was formed, and then an additional decade afterward. I have seen, and I'm not just saying healthcare, but I think we all see the flavor of the day, the program of the day, we're going to do this, and then it doesn't work. We've seen consultants suggest something, and it's great, and we'll do it, and then we didn't do it. And, I think you can look at that across industries. I think the fact that Root Cause, which was just some kind of off-the-cuff idea at the end of a meeting, that it is here a decade later and growing, and that there is passion for the issues and increased realization that we need to shore up these safety nets, make them tougher, wider, deeper. We need to look beyond ourselves, beyond our immediate circle, if you will. I see that growing, not shrinking. And I don't give root cause sole credit. I think coalitions and organizations that are lifting up these social needs, social drivers, social determinants, basic needs, preventive health issues, however you want to say it, I think that's a win because we've lived in a time where it wasn't on the radar. It was not being realized to the extent that it needed to be. COVID was a horrific time for this world and certainly for our nation. What COVID did do, though, was uncover a lot of issues that we all knew were in existence. We knew people had food and nutrition insecurity. We knew the issue of homelessness. We knew the issue of what low wages, the strain and the stress that such a low wage, how it locked people into a place from which it was hard to move from. I think the biggest challenge in front of us is to make sure that what COVID exposed does not go back into the shadows as we get a handle on or move from that global pandemic, because we have global issues that if we don't face them now, I don't know. I have two grandsons. We were on vacation recently together as a family, and I look at this 2.5-year-old and a little over 1-year-old, and the innocence and the purity of children. And it was the week where the country was melting under heat waves, and don't take your dogs on a walk because the cement is too hot, and don't allow your kids to be outside. It's like we're literally on fire, figuratively and literally. And there are issues where if we don't come together to work on solving them, it really doesn't matter what neighborhood or state you live in. It's going to be a moot point. We have got to figure this out. And so I look to my husband and his optimism and get a dose from him every morning. And I look toward the children that I think we all owe our best effort, our best foot forward. This isn't about us anymore, quite frankly. This is about those who are coming behind us. And we have got to dig deep and figure out, what can I do? It might be getting involved in something locally with your church or a food pantry or volunteering at school or a senior center, or I don't know what. There are so many ways in which people can get involved. This is something that, as you know, because you've been a guest on Root of the Issue, the podcast that we do at Root Cause, I always make it a point to say, how do people get involved? How do you help people become involved? Because people feel so much, I think, that their own voice isn't heard or that nobody wants to hear their voice. And it's easy to say, well, if you have something to say, make a seat for yourself. Bring your own chair if you don't think there's a seat at the table. Well, okay, that sounds great. And we've said it a lot. But you know what? It's on all of us to look around and say, hey, who's missing from this conversation? Who do we need to make room for? What other chairs do we need to drag in here so that we can get all the perspectives that we need? And if we're afraid to hear all the perspectives, then I would say we're not approaching this with a true heart toward the issues. We don't want to be that echo chamber that we too often hear in different media outlets. We want to be that full picture, warts and all, of issues that have long been unaddressed. Okay, how do we address them? And I'll spend the rest of my days on this planet trying to make a difference. And maybe sometimes and going forward, as I, go fully into retirement, the arena won't be as big, but it will be an arena. And people need to figure out, hey, if it's going to help 10 people in your community, great. If it's going to help one person in your community, great. If it's going to really affect something nationally, wonderful. They're all good, but doing nothing is not an option. Doing something is what I believe is incumbent on all of us. And finding that greater purpose, just like I go back to when I started out in health policy, it's like, well, this is okay, but wouldn't it be better if we started talking about nutrition and all those other things that affect every single person? And doesn't mean we're going to discount those immediate needs of the industry, but we can bring more people into the conversation when we talk about these universal needs and, frankly, these universal truths, is that people need food, they need shelter, they need to know that they're cared for, they need to know that they're respected, and they deserve a life of dignity. And I just don't think we need to make it any more difficult than that.
Listen, I'm over here nodding my head. It's true. Like, what do you want to do? I mean, I talk about this in trauma informed systems is that it's so easy to say, well, my boss doesn't buy in, or our board doesn't buy in, or the community doesn't buy in. And I say it all the time, like, what's your power? You have to learn to own your power and what is the change you can make. Don't always focus on the naysayers, the outliers, the people who are never going to join you in your cause. Just what is it you can do, and who can you bring to help you, because you're going to need the help. And so we've got to stay in that way. There's a place. So we're going to do some quick fire questions, Barb, but before we get there, what is, like, in your experience, and you've led a lot of people, you've been a leader for a long time, you know that especially right now, staff morale across the board coming out of COVID is something every sector is facing, not just healthcare, but we know how prevalent it is in healthcare. What's, like, one immediate action you would recommend to leaders who maybe want to do some long-term changes, but they just need a boost this week for their staff to make it through, to even get themselves in that mental space to think about long-term changes? What's one thing you'd recommend right now that organizations could do to improve staff morale, especially considering and taking into account social determinants or social drivers of health?
The first thing that comes to mind is rounding, and that's clearly my healthcare background coming through. But, I was in administration, and we rounded. It didn't matter if we had the clinical initials behind our title. I would go into the hospitals, and I would walk into units and introduce myself and say, "Do you have what you need? How are things going?" They're like, "Who are you? Wait a minute, what are you asking me?" And once we got past that shock, amazing conversations. If people know you care, if people know they are being heard, wow, just look at the change. And it takes time. I realize that. I know C-suite leaders are inundated with a lot of things that most people, most employees do not see. It is not just sitting in an ivory tower somewhere. I know that from having been in a position of, administration and responsibility over many areas. But you have got to make the time to go to where people are. We always say we have to meet people where they're at. Well, go to their workspace, go to their cubicle, go to the hospital, go to the unit that they're on, go out to whatever your industry is where those employees are. Don't be the undercover boss. Be the boss that shows up fully exposed and say, "I need to hear from you. I know you're going through some tough times. Stick with us. I want to hear what we can do better." That will do wonders for morale. And I just think that, again, that goes back to that connecting in humanity, right, that we talked about earlier. And if you can't do individual rounding because the space is so big and you might oversee a national organization in many states, then do a virtual call, do a virtual town hall and do it often. And don't be afraid to take the questions. Don't ask for questions to be submitted in advance. Take them as they come. People just want to know they're being heard and listened to. And when we show up, they show up. And when they show up, we show up. And then it's not a we, they, it's us. And I think that's the best thing. I know the difference that it made for me in my role. I oversaw pastoral care in one of the iterations of my responsibilities, and I would go to their monthly meeting, and there you had chaplains from every faith. And they would always thank me profusely for coming. And I was like, "Oh, no, thank you. What you have given me in this hour and sharing what you've done for our patients and families when, quite frankly, there was nothing more that could be done medically. And it was all on them to carry someone through from a spiritual standpoint. You just need to step outside yourself and go walk in someone else's shoes or space and see that, wow, we have a lot of good things happening in our organizations. We have a lot of good things happening in our nation. There is always will believe, and when I stop believing, that's going to be a very sad day, that goodness can overcome whatever darkness we might feel. It's on all of us to seek it out, and if someone is having a hard time seeing it, then it's on us to help that individual see it as well."
I love your idea of rounding. As we're recording this, we're just kind of coming out of this CrowdStrike fiasco. And because I travel and I'm a Delta girl by heart, Delta was really affected. And one of the things is I was stuck in an airport that I was thinking about from a leadership and being the customer in that case, not an employee is, and you're talking about, listen, there's how many Delta desks across the world, right? So you can't as a leader be everywhere. But I thought, if that leader would have just shown up and I would have saw him working a customer service desk, even in a photo on social media somewhere, the power of that, right? Or that he was loading bags in Atlanta or in Detroit where they were everywhere, just organizing bags at the baggage claim, how that would have confirmed me as a customer forever. Because bad things are going to happen in our organizations that we have no control. Delta had no control over CrowdStrike. We all know that. I logically know that. But the way in which you handle the adversity and the way you help the staff who's on the front lines who has to handle that adversity says a lot for me. And so I love your idea of rounding and what that means. So, quick fire, Barb, tell us what's the latest book or show that you're binge watching or reading that's caught your attention? What should our readers? It can be for fun.
Well, it's for fun because novels, fiction are is my escape. So, Table for Two is my current. Amor Towles, Towles, is just an extraordinary writer. It's 6 short stories and 1 novella. I'm going to sound like his agent here, but his first book was Rules of Civility, and then A Gentleman in Moscow, The Lincoln Highway. This just came out this summer, and I'm just devouring it. And I love the way he writes. It's pure poetry and literature, if you will. So can't say enough about him.
Love it. Table for Two. If you could have dinner with any historical or contemporary leader, who would you choose and what one question would you want to ask them?
Goodness, you are asking some tough questions. I know it's supposed to tell you right off the top of my head. I know who I would ask to dinner or have dinner with. Let's go with Eleanor Roosevelt. She comes to mind.
What would you want to ask her?
How'd you do it against all the odds?
She's a remarkable woman.
She was a remarkable woman, and I think that she sure was a model for women who came after her to just keep pushing through. And say what you will about her, and there's been a lot said about her, but man, she could and needed to do, and she did it. And she shoved open some doors for a lot of people. And I love that she, not only the humanitarian issues that she took up, she also made sure that the arts were kept alive during a very difficult time in our nation's history. And I just think a community without art, and be it literally, visual art or literature or music, I mean, I think she was an amazing leader and probably doesn't get the attention she should. So I would have dinner with Eleanor, and I love that name too.
I know. It's a good one. What one hobby activity is consuming your time right now? You're newly into the retirement phase, or what's the thing you wish was consuming your time? What's the joy? What's the joy filler for you right now?
It truly is the simple things. I think I've been on such a busy schedule for so long that I am just enjoying the downtime. And I very intentionally chose July, not the first of the year, to retire because in the Midwest, when it's dark at 5 o'clock and probably really cold, you don't want to just feel like you're hibernating for 4 or 5 months.
No, July 1st feels like January 1st for us Midwesterners.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So July has been kind of this mode of summer vacation that I haven't felt since I was a very, very, very young girl. And I'm stopping in the middle of the day to take my dog on a walk or sit on the back porch with my dog and read Table for Two and the next book that's on the stack, or peruse a magazine and just enjoy my home and really downshift and get into a slower gear. That is what I'm really consuming my time with, because people are like, oh, you're going to be bored. I'm like, I don't think I'm going to be bored. I think I'm going to be ecstatic.
Just know that I'm jealous, and so is probably 90% of our listeners right now are like, hey, how do we sign up for that?
I'm not going to lie. People are like, oh, you're going to be so bored so soon. You're used to doing so much. I'm like, at first I would try and defend it in all sorts of ways. It's like, I finally have started to say, I don't think I was ever boring before, so I don't think I'm going to be bored now. But I know it's kind of a play on words. But yesterday I did some errands in the middle of the day, and I was like, I got home and it was 3:30 and I'm thinking, this is amazing. I had some fun. I did some shopping. I had to run to the grocery store. I had to pick up some, dry cleaning. It was like, I got to do all that, not, oh my gosh, I have to get there before it closes or cram everything into a Saturday. It's just this newfound time for me. I think, when we work, regardless of what our role and responsibility is, I think there's a lot of ourselves that we have to put up on a shelf or off to the side. Raising 2 children into adulthood and wanting to make sure I did everything and we did everything we possibly could for them. Check the box, check the box, check the box. And I was like, I'm going to exhale and take a little bit of the Barb that was put aside and find her again. And that's been really fun.
So happy for you. So, Barb, as we wrap up, we'll put links, of course, to the Root Cause Coalition in our thing. Chefalo Consulting is super excited to be a member of the Root Cause Coalition as well. We know that you have a yearly conference that you do, a gathering, if you will. But what other things do you want to tell us about Root Cause, or how can people get in touch with you directly? What's your preference there? And what else do they need to know?
So in addition to the National Summit, I know because we've been really working to make sure that there's programs that individuals and organizations can participate in year-round. So look for a really robust slate of webinars that are starting this fall and will go all the way through 25 and beyond, because I don't think we can learn from each other enough, lifting up best practices, sharing experiences in this space on whatever the specific issues are. So there's a lot there. rootcausecoalition.org is the website. My email is B as in Barb, Petee, Petee, at rootcausecoalition.org. And you can find me there, or you can just go into the general mailbox there that's on the website. But there's a lot of different ways to connect with us. We have individual membership now, which is something we didn't have until this year. We have all levels of membership for organizations because we know one budget does not fit all. We have large national organizations as members. We have very, very small community organizations as members. And so we will work with anyone to make sure we can meet them where their budget is at to become a member and include their voice, which is what is most important to us. So we're delighted to have you, Shen, as a member. Chefalo Consulting. You and I met years ago. You spoke at our 2019 summit, and I had heard you several months prior to that, and it was just an instant connection, I dare say, and the rest is history. And so I'm delighted to have been able to share my thoughts, comments with you today. It's been a very fun conversation. You've made it easy. I'm usually the one on the other side of the microphone, so I was a little hesitant. I was like, but this has been fun, and I appreciate it, and I appreciate you and everything you're doing.
So glad to have you on. Also, we should tell them that the Root Cause has their very own podcast, Root of the Issue, which people should follow and leave reviews as well. It's another good one talking about a lot of the topics we covered here today. They have a lot of amazing guests. I listen to it. It's a podcast that I subscribe to. Barb, thanks again for being a part of this. We look forward to having you and some of the other Root Cause staff on our show again in the future. And I hope you and Tim will come up and have some wine on the back deck now that you have more time.
There you go. We will make a date.
Sounds good.
Absolutely. Shen, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to be with you today.
As always, and for our listeners, one step at a time. We'll see you next time. Mindful Management, Creating a Trauma-Informed Work Environment is brought to you by Chefalo Consulting. To learn more about Chefalo Consulting and our trauma-informed change management and professional development solutions, please visit chefaloconsulting.com. That's Chefalo, CHEFALO, consulting.com. Make sure you don't miss these transformative conversations by subscribing to Mindful Management wherever you get your podcast. Thanks for listening. And remember, change happens one step at a time.